She went out for a jog in 1980 and never came back. No screams, no confirmed suspect, no immediate answers. Just a quiet Maine town where a 16-year-old girl named Joyce McLain vanished into a familiar stretch of road and straight into a mystery that would outlive an entire generation. 2 days later, her body was found not far from where she was last seen. And that's where the case should have made sense, but it didn't, because the scene didn't tell a clear story. The timeline didn't line up cleanly. And the early investigation hit something investigators dread most: silence that refuses to break. For years, the file stayed open, but inactive. Leads dried up, suspects faded into background noise, and the case became one of those names people whisper about. Not because it's solved, but because it isn't. Then something strange happened. Decades later, a name tied to the original investigation never fully disappeared. It resurfaced through unrelated legal trouble, and suddenly old statements, old interviews, old inconsistencies were dragged back into the light. And that's when the real tension begins. Because this case didn't crack open with DNA. It didn't collapse under a confession. It shifted under something far more unsettling. Years-old words being treated like evidence, strong enough to send someone to prison. So what really happened in those missing hours in 1980? And how does a case stay frozen for 36 years, only to restart without a single new physical clue? Because if the answer was always there, why did it take decades to see it? Before we dive deeper into the story of Joyce McLain, tell me where you are watching from in the comment section, and kindly subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue producing in-depth crime documentaries like this one. Stories that not only seek answers for victims and their families, but also raise awareness about the circumstances surrounding these crimes. Your support helps this channel grow and continue its mission of using knowledge, awareness, and education as tools in the fight against crime. Now, let's get to the details of Joyce McLain's story. It began in a town where nothing was supposed to happen. East Millinocket, Maine, a place where life moved slowly, predictably, almost safely. A paper mill town wrapped in forests so dense that sound seemed to disappear into them. Everyone knew everyone. Doors were left unlocked more often than they were locked. And for a long time, that rhythm of quiet certainty was exactly what made it feel secure. But on one summer evening in 1980, that illusion quietly began to crack. Because somewhere in that small town, a 16-year-old girl named Joyce McLain stepped out into the fading light and never made it back. No dramatic argument, no visible threat, no warning that anyone would later recognize. Just a routine evening that should have ended like every other. And that is where the first unsettling question begins. How does a teenager vanish in a place where everyone knows her name? Joyce McLain was not someone drifting through life unnoticed. She was known in her school as bright, disciplined, and socially grounded. A student who kept her future in view with a kind of quiet determination that teachers tend to remember. She was involved in school activities, connected to friends, and known within her community as a steady presence, the kind of teenager parents feel comfortable letting out into the world. There was nothing in her daily life that suggested risk was waiting around the corner. And that makes what happened next even harder to reconcile. Because Joyce did something she had done before, something simple, something ordinary. She went for a jog. It was the evening of August 8th, 1980. The air was still warm enough to be comfortable, but the kind of Maine summer night where daylight begins to lose its grip earlier than expected. The sky shifting slowly toward dusk. The town beginning its transition into evening routines, dinner tables, porch lights, radios humming quietly in the background of daily life. Joyce left home for a run near familiar grounds, an area close to Schenck High School where open fields met wooded edges, a place she knew, a place she had likely passed many times before without concern. This was not unusual. That is what makes it so dangerous in hindsight, because most real-world disappearances do not begin with danger clearly announced. They begin with normality. At some point during that run, Joyce was last seen alive. That detail is critical, not just for investigators later, but for understanding how quickly normal life can lose continuity without anyone noticing in real time. There were no immediate alarms raised in the moment she didn't return. No sudden panic across the town. No obvious signal that something irreversible had already happened, because in small communities like this, delay often disguises urgency. People assume she stopped to talk, or stayed out longer than expected, or simply changed her route. Assumptions fill the gaps where information should be, and time, quiet, indifferent time, keeps moving forward. But then something began to feel wrong. Hours passed, then night deepened, and Joyce McLain still had not come home. At first, concern likely built slowly. The kind of concern that tries to remain rational, that tries to explain absence before it admits fear. But as the evening stretched on, that explanation started to collapse under its own weight. Because a 16-year-old girl does not simply disappear without leaving a trace of explanation behind. Not in a town like this. By the time attention turned fully toward her absence, the landscape had already changed. Night had settled in completely, and somewhere beyond the comfort of homes and streetlights, Joyce McLain was no longer part of the predictable rhythm of the town. What remained instead was uncertainty, the most dangerous state in any missing person case, because uncertainty delays response, delays urgency, and sometimes delays survival of evidence itself. And in this case, that delay would matter more than anyone could have known. When authorities eventually began to trace her last known movements, they were already dealing with a critical disadvantage. Time had passed, the environment had shifted, and the exact sequence of what happened during that jog was already slipping into ambiguity. There were no cameras, no digital trail, no instant communication chain, just memory, just witness recollection. Just fragments of observation that would later be tested against the harsh precision of forensic investigation. And even those fragments were limited. The wooded area near Schenck High School, quiet, familiar, and unremarkable, would soon become the focus of a search that no one in East Millinocket had ever expected to see. Because once a missing teenager becomes a case file, everything changes. The same paths that once felt ordinary begin to feel unreadable. Every patch of forest becomes a possibility. Every silence begins to feel intentional. And still, at this stage, no one knew the full truth. Only that Joyce McLain had gone out for a run and had not returned. And as the hours turned into a night of growing unease, one question began forming quietly beneath all the uncertainty. Was this a disappearance? Or had something already happened long before anyone realized it? Because somewhere in the space between her last known step and her absence from home, a story had already crossed a line that no one in East Millinocket could yet see. When a case goes cold for decades, details tend to blur. But what rarely fades is the human outline of the person at the center of it. Joyce McLain was not a mystery in her community before she disappeared. She was a known presence, not because she sought attention, but because she fit into the fabric of everyday life in East Millinocket in a way that felt stable, almost predictable. Teachers recognized her. Classmates trusted her. Neighbors knew her by sight, and that familiarity is important, because it creates the psychological contrast that makes her disappearance so difficult to process. This was not someone already drifting toward the edges of society. This was someone firmly inside it. At school, Joyce was regarded as a diligent student, the kind who did not need to be pushed into effort. She already carried it with her. Her academic presence suggested discipline, but not rigidity. Socially, she was engaged enough to be known, but not the center of controversy or conflict. She was, in many ways, a steady signal in the environment around her. And that matters in missing person cases, because investigators often begin by asking a fundamental question. Is this someone who could disappear quietly, or someone whose absence would immediately ripple outward? In Joyce's case, the ripple did not come instantly, but when it did, it spread quickly. Outside of school, her life reflected the rhythm of a small-town teenager in 1980. There were no public signs of instability, no widely reported conflicts that would later define investigative theories, no known pattern of behavior that suggested she was at risk of vanishing without explanation. Instead, there was routine, and routine is often what makes later events feel so disorienting. Because the human mind is not designed to anticipate sudden breaks in predictable patterns, especially in environments that feel safe. On the surface, East Millinocket itself reinforced that sense of safety. It was the kind of place where geography creates psychological comfort. Forests surrounding the town, industry anchoring it, and social familiarity reinforcing trust. People moved through shared spaces repeatedly. Faces were recognizable, behavior patterns were easy to read. In that kind of environment, danger does not feel absent, it feels distant, until it isn't. When Joyce failed to return from her evening run, the first reactions were not immediate panic. They were uncertainty, layered with rationalization. Maybe she stopped to talk with someone. Maybe she extended her route. Maybe she lost track of time. These explanations are not unusual in early missing person scenarios. In fact, they are almost universal, because the human brain resists the first interpretation that implies irreversible harm. But as time passed, those explanations began to lose structure, because absence, when it persists without reason, starts to shift from possibility to signal. By the time concern turned into active searching, the emotional state of the community had already begun to change. What was once routine evening life became fragmented attention. Conversations repeated the same name. People began retracing mental maps of where she might have been seen last. Memory became investigative material, even before police formally organized a structured search. And in small towns, this transition happens quickly, because distance between people is minimal, emotionally as much as physically. For Joyce's family, that transition was not theoretical, it was immediate. The absence of a teenager does not remain abstract for long in a household. It becomes physical, a missing presence in rooms, in routines, in the simple expectations of daily life. A door that should open, a voice that should answer, a return that should have already happened. And when those things do not occur, time becomes heavier, not faster. As night settled over East Millinocket, the uncertainty deepened into something more structured, concern with direction, but no target. Authorities would eventually begin to map her last known movements. But at this early stage, the information available was limited. Fragmented witness recollections, uncertain timelines, and the absence of any immediate forensic trail. That absence is critical, because in 1980, investigative capability was heavily dependent on speed and visibility. Without rapid discovery of evidence, the probability of reconstructing a precise sequence of events drops sharply. And in this case, that window was already closing. What makes cases like this particularly haunting is not just what is unknown, it is how quickly the unknown replaces what was once ordinary. A town that once measured time in shifts, school days, and evening routines suddenly begins measuring it in uncertainty. Every hour without answers increases emotional pressure, but also reduces investigative clarity. And in that narrowing space, every detail matters, or disappears entirely. By the time the search effort begins to take shape, one uncomfortable reality has already emerged beneath the surface. Joyce McLain is no longer simply missing. She is now part of a developing investigation, one that is already struggling against time, environment, and the limitations of the era. And somewhere in the wooded edges outside Schenck High School, where she was last seen alive, the truth is already separating itself from the assumptions that once surrounded her disappearance. There are moments in every missing person case that become fixed points in time, not because they are dramatic, but because they are the last moment when the person still existed within the known world. For Joyce McLain, that moment was tied to something painfully ordinary. A jog, a familiar route, a path she had likely taken before without hesitation. And that is what makes it so difficult to reconstruct, because nothing about it suggested it would become significant, until it did. On the evening of August 8, 1980, Joyce McLain left her home for a run in the area surrounding Schenck High School in East Millinocket, Maine. It was not unusual for someone her age to be outside in that way. In a small town, physical activity often blends into the natural rhythm of community life. There were no structured safety concerns in the modern sense, no tracking devices, no immediate check-in expectations, no digital visibility, just movement and trust in familiarity. At some point during that run, Joyce was last seen alive. That fact is one of the most important anchors in the entire investigation, because it defines the final known boundary between certainty and uncertainty. Everything before that sighting is context. Everything after it is interpretation. And what happens in between becomes the central question of the case. Investigators would later attempt to reconstruct her route. The area around Schenck High School included open athletic fields, wooded tree lines, and informal walking and running paths. It was the kind of environment that feels controlled because it is close to civilization, but is actually transitional space, where visibility drops quickly and surveillance is essentially non-existent. In 1980, that absence of oversight mattered even more. Because there were no cameras to confirm direction, no phones to confirm timing, no GPS data to establish movement patterns, only witness memory. And memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. In the early stages of the investigation, authorities had to rely heavily on these fragmented recollections: who saw her, when she was seen, where she might have been headed. But each of these data points carries a natural problem. They are filtered through perception, time delay, and uncertainty. And when combined, they rarely form a perfect sequence. Instead, they form probability. As hours passed after her disappearance, the emotional temperature in the town began to shift. At first, there was hesitation to interpret her absence as something serious. That hesitation is common, especially in communities where crime of this nature is not part of daily expectation. But as daylight faded into night, the lack of return could no longer be rationalized easily, because routine disruptions eventually demand explanation, and none was arriving. When authorities began formal attention toward the case, they entered an immediate disadvantage. Time had already moved forward without preservation. Environmental conditions had already changed the scene, and the exact path Joyce took had already become partially speculative. This is a critical point in understanding cold case formation, not because of what is known, but because of what is already lost before investigation begins. Search efforts began to form around areas she was known to frequent. The wooded region behind the school became a focal point almost by necessity, not because it immediately revealed evidence, but because it represented the last logical extension of her known movement. In missing person investigations, geography often becomes a narrowing funnel. Start wide, eliminate certainty, and focus on last known proximity. And in Joyce McLain's case, that funnel led investigators toward the forest edge. But even at this stage, there was no immediate indication of what had occurred. No clear scene, no direct physical trail, nor early confirmation of foul play. Only absence, structured, expanding, and increasingly difficult to interpret as anything other than significant. And that is where the psychological shift in the case begins to form. Because investigators are not only dealing with a missing person, they are dealing with a disappearance that is already resisting explanation. The longer a case remains without clarity, the more it shifts from search to reconstruction. And reconstruction requires evidence that may no longer exist. By the time the night deepened fully over East Millinocket, one truth had already begun to settle into the investigation. Quietly, without announcement, Joyce McLain's disappearance was no longer a question of location. It was becoming a question of what had already happened in the space between her last known step and her absence from home. And that space was already expanding. In most missing person cases, there is a moment that changes everything. Not because it brings answers immediately, but because it removes ambiguity. For Joyce McLain, that moment came when the search for a missing teenager shifted into something far more serious, a recovery operation, and then an investigation into a death. It was August 10th, 1980, 2 days after Joyce was last seen. By this point, search efforts in East Millinocket had expanded beyond informal concern. What began as a community response had now drawn structured attention, including law enforcement coordination and organized search patterns through areas she was known to have accessed. The wooded regions behind Schenck High School were no longer just places of possibility. They were now zones of priority. And then Joyce McLain was found. Her body was located in a wooded area near the school's athletic fields, not far from where she had last been seen alive during her jog. That proximity immediately altered the investigative direction, because in missing person cases, distance matters. A short distance between last sighting and discovery often suggests urgency in events, a compressed timeline that investigators must carefully reconstruct. But at this stage, the exact sequence of that timeline was still unknown. Only the outcome was clear. The initial law enforcement response would have been shaped by one immediate reality. This was no longer a search for a missing person. It was a potential homicide investigation. And that shift changes everything: procedure, priority, and the way every detail is treated. The area where Joyce was found did not immediately offer clarity. There was no obvious narrative written into the environment that could be quickly interpreted. Instead, investigators were confronted with a scene that required careful forensic reconstruction under the limitations of 1980-era investigative technology. And those limitations were significant. No DNA profiling as we know it today, no digital mapping, and no advanced trace recovery systems. Just physical observation, documentation, and inference. Medical examination determined that Joyce had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. That finding established an important legal threshold: the involvement of external force. In investigative terms, it shifted the case firmly into the category of suspected homicide. However, beyond that conclusion, many critical questions remained unresolved at the time, questions that would shape the next several decades of investigation. One of the most challenging aspects of the scene was the lack of a clear, preserved evidentiary trail. Environmental conditions, including weather changes in the days surrounding the disappearance, had the potential to affect trace evidence significantly. In outdoor cases like this, time is not just an investigative factor. It is an active eraser. Rain, wind, and natural movement can degrade or disperse critical forensic indicators before they are ever documented. As investigators worked the scene, they were operating within constraints that are difficult to fully appreciate in a modern context. Today, even a small, rural crime scene might be processed with layered technological support. But in 1980, investigators relied heavily on visual observation, physical marking of evidence, interviews conducted in real time, and immediate contextual reasoning. That means the case was already dependent on interpretation, not just data. Despite the limitations, one fact was now legally and medically established: Joyce McLain's death was not accidental. And that conclusion transformed every subsequent step in the investigation. Witness statements that might have been considered routine were now scrutinized. Movement patterns were reevaluated. Any potential contact Joyce may have had before her disappearance became relevant. But even with that shift, investigators faced a persistent problem. There was no immediate suspect with clear evidentiary linkage. No recovered weapon conclusively tied to an individual. No direct eyewitness account of the fatal moment. No immediate confession or physical trace connecting a perpetrator to the scene. In legal terms, the case was now grounded in suspicion, but not yet attribution. And that gap would define the investigation for decades. The emotional impact on the community was immediate but contained. In small towns, tragedy does not remain abstract for long. It becomes personal quickly because people recognize proximity in a way larger cities often do not. A familiar school, a familiar walking route, and a familiar name. And suddenly, familiarity itself becomes unsettling. For Joyce's family, this moment marked a transition from uncertainty to confirmation, but not closure. Because confirmation of death does not explain how it happened, or why, or who was responsible. It only ends the search. It does not end the questions. And so, as East Millinocket processed the reality of what had occurred just beyond its everyday spaces, investigators were left with a case that had now fully transitioned into one of the most difficult categories in criminal justice: a homicide without immediate resolution. A scene without a clear narrative, and a timeline that had already begun to slip further into the past. But the investigation was not over. In fact, what happened next would stretch across decades, involving revisited statements, shifting suspects, and a case file that refused to close. Because even when a crime scene goes silent, the truth does not always disappear. It waits. Some cases do not remain active because answers are found. They remain active because the questions never fully stop. For Joyce McLain, the investigation did not end in the early 1980s. It simply entered a different phase, one defined not by movement, but by waiting. Waiting for new information. Waiting for inconsistencies to surface. Waiting for something in the record to change. And for many years, nothing did. As time passed, the case settled into what law enforcement often calls cold status. That does not mean forgotten. It means paused. Still present in files, still open in principle, but no longer generating forward momentum. In practical terms, resources move elsewhere. Investigators rotate, leads diminish, memory fades. And the physical world around the case changes faster than the case itself can be updated. That is the quiet reality of cold cases. They do not disappear, they stagnate. But stagnation does not mean the file is dead. It means it is waiting for friction, something new, to interact with old evidence. And in Joyce McLain's case, that friction would eventually come from an unexpected direction. Not from the original crime scene, but from the continued life of someone already connected to the investigation. Over the years, investigators periodically revisited the case file, not continuously, but strategically, as new tools, new information techniques, and new investigative frameworks became available. This is a common pattern in cold case work. Old evidence is not always new evidence, but new interpretation of old evidence can change everything. One of the key challenges in this case was the absence of definitive forensic linkage that could survive modern scrutiny standards. But investigators did not only rely on physical evidence. They also re-examined prior witness statements, behavioral inconsistencies, and individuals previously identified as persons of interest. And among those names, one continued to reappear across different investigative periods: Philip Scott Fournier. Fournier had been identified early in the original investigation as someone of interest, but at the time, the case did not progress to charges. That does not necessarily indicate innocence or guilt in legal terms. It reflects evidentiary thresholds and prosecutorial readiness at a given moment. In 1980, those thresholds were significantly harder to meet without physical corroboration. So the case remained unresolved, and Fournier remained outside formal prosecution. But over time, something changed in how his connection to the case was viewed, not because of one single breakthrough, but because of accumulated attention, small details revisited, statements reevaluated, and patterns reconsidered under modern investigative logic. Cold cases often resolve not through a single revelation, but through convergence. Multiple weak signals gradually forming a stronger inference. A major turning point came years later, when Fournier became involved in unrelated legal proceedings. During that period, references and statements tied to his past were revisited under scrutiny. Investigators began reevaluating whether prior accounts and alleged admissions carried evidentiary weight that had not been fully leveraged in earlier decades. This is where cold cases often shift direction, not at the scene, but in the legal environment surrounding the suspect. In legal terms, what became important was not only physical evidence, but credibility patterns. Repeated statements, inconsistent accounts, and alleged admissions made in different contexts over time. Individually, none of these elements automatically proves guilt, but in combination, they can meet the standard of probable cause when evaluated alongside the totality of circumstances. By the mid-2010s, the case was no longer just a historical file. It had become an active reconsideration. Investigators were no longer asking only what happened in 1980. They were asking whether the evidence, viewed through modern investigative standards, now supported charges that had once been impossible to pursue. In March 2016, that reassessment reached a critical point. After decades of investigative review, Philip Scott Fournier was arrested and charged in connection with the murder of Joyce McLain. The arrest did not emerge from a single new piece of forensic evidence. It emerged from the accumulation of years of reanalysis and the legal determination that the threshold for prosecution had finally been met. And just like that, a case that had remained dormant for more than 3 decades re-entered the criminal justice system. But an arrest is not a conclusion. It is a transition, from investigation to courtroom scrutiny, from suspicion to legal testing, from theory to burden of proof. And in cases like this, the most difficult phase is often still ahead, because the courtroom does not ask what investigators believe. It asks what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And after 36 years, memory, evidence, and interpretation all come under intense pressure. As the legal process began to unfold, the case that had once been defined by silence was now entering a different kind of confrontation, one where every statement, every recollection, and every inference would be tested against the standards of criminal law. And the outcome would determine whether decades of uncertainty would finally resolve into conviction or collapse back into ambiguity. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the question was no longer whether the passage of time mattered. It already had. 36 years had reshaped memories, scattered witnesses, changed investigative standards, and tested the limits of what criminal justice can reconstruct from the past. But the legal system does not measure time the way people do. It measures evidence, admissibility, credibility, corroboration, and whether, taken together, the record can satisfy the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial of Philip Scott Fournier was not a typical jury-driven proceeding. It was conducted as a bench trial, meaning the presiding judge alone evaluated the evidence and determined the verdict. In legal strategy terms, bench trials often center heavily on admissibility of contested statements, reliability of long-delayed recollections, and structured interpretation of circumstantial evidence. This format places even greater emphasis on legal reasoning over emotional persuasion. The prosecution's case did not rely on a single modern forensic breakthrough. Instead, it was built on a combination of elements: prior investigative findings, witness statements gathered over time, and alleged admissions attributed to the defendant in various contexts. The argument, in essence, was not that one piece of evidence was decisive, but that the totality of evidence formed a coherent and consistent narrative of responsibility. The defense, however, focused on a fundamental legal challenge: the absence of direct physical evidence linking the defendant to the crime scene. In criminal law, especially in serious felony cases, the defense standard is not to prove innocence, but to demonstrate that the prosecution has not met the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Key defense themes included the reliability of decades-old recollections, potential distortion of memory over time, and the lack of modern forensic linkage, such as DNA confirmation. They also challenged the interpretation of alleged admissions, arguing that context and accuracy could not be fully verified after so many years. This created the central tension of the trial: two competing interpretations of the same historical record, one viewing the evidence as converging toward responsibility, the other viewing it as insufficiently precise to support conviction, and the court had to determine which interpretation met the legal threshold. After reviewing the evidence, the court reached its conclusion. Philip Scott Fournier was found guilty of murder in connection with the death of Joyce McLain. The verdict marked the end of the trial phase, but not the end of legal process. Because in cases involving cold evidence and delayed prosecution, appeals are often expected, particularly when constitutional or evidentiary issues are raised. The sentencing phase followed, bringing the case into its final judicial outcome. Fournier was sentenced to 45 years in prison, a penalty reflecting both the severity of the crime and the legal framework available under Maine law at the time of sentencing. The sentence represented not just punishment, but formal closure within the limits of the justice system. Following the conviction, the case was reviewed again through the appellate system. The Maine Supreme Judicial Court later upheld the conviction, reinforcing the trial court's determination that the evidence presented met the required legal standard. At that stage, the verdict transitioned from trial outcome to confirmed judgment. But legal resolution does not automatically translate into emotional resolution. For Joyce McLain's family, the outcome carried a complex emotional weight. After decades of uncertainty, there was finally a defined answer within the justice system. But that answer did not erase the passage of time. It did not recover lost years, and it did not restore what had been taken. Statements from family members reflected a dual reality common in long-delayed cases: a sense of relief that accountability had been established, and a simultaneous recognition that closure is never complete when the timeline spans generations. Justice, in this context, was not an ending. It was a form of acknowledgement. For the community, the case became a long arc of memory, finally reaching resolution, a reminder that unresolved cases do not fade. They accumulate weight over time, and when they finally resolve, they do so not quietly, but with the full force of everything that has been waiting in silence. The Joyce McLain case stands as a reminder of several enduring truths in criminal justice. Time does not erase responsibility, but it complicates its proof. Cold cases are not closed stories. They are paused investigations. And justice, when delayed, is still justice, but it carries the burden of all the years it took to arrive. Thank you for watching. If you find this documentary valuable, kindly subscribe and turn on the notification bell so that you will get notified as soon as the next episode drops. Here is another horrific cold case that left detectives confused and left them at a dead end until a piece of evidence they didn't pay attention to led to the arrest of the suspect who had been roaming free for decades. With